this computer. I don't know where Jim and Jumping Jim, what we call him. He's a ROTC's first sergeant. He's retiring this year. Okay, like I said, we was talking about Roman numeral number 3. I forget where in the book that is, but it's lesson 7, chapter 7. Went too far. If you have the book, it's 199. I had something written up on the blackboard, and so I might have to do that during our break to explain something about the seating arrangements in reference to when they ate. I mean, that's one of the things that comes up, and so I had it last week up on the board, but we didn't get there. We had actually gotten down as we went down through there for about 10 paragraphs. And on the 11th paragraph, I think it is, we're talking about one of Ovid's poems, Amor's, how that it can serve an example of what might happen at a dinner party. And so the poet is actually, when you read this poetry, you have to make sure that we get the context, but he's actually addressing his mistress, whose husband has filed up their plans by deciding to come to dinner. So Ovid says he'll be in agony reclining on a couch opposite them, watching her husband reclining next to her. So, and he talks about some other things and talks about private moments. And he actually talks about, you know, how that they did back then. He says, don't let him put his arms around your neck. Don't lay your sweet head on his rough chest. Don't let him, don't let his, go on. It's not too nice about what all he says. And he says that this is the type of thing. In other words, it was a closeness that was there. And in the book, if you want to read everything there, stuff that that I probably would not have would have said. But he really talks about it, and it's basically, like a husband and wife, and how they're being romantic on their own sofa at home, and that's what they're doing. But he's been invited to. He was going to be there with this man's wife, but the man showed up for dinner too. So. But the last sentence in reference to the poem, Ovid's dread that his mistress and her husband would actually do their husband-wife thing. And so he begs her not to wear certain clothing and so forth. And so he goes on and on about that in reference to the activities that were going to be done in reference to that. But the point being is this is how they deal with that of meals. And it's actually this idea of their drinking and let's see, let me go back. The activities which he describes in the poem were made possible, even encouraged by the fact that the Romans are, while they reclining on their sofas or their couches, as they call them, on the left elbow, reaching for food and drink with the right hand. That's the way they all did it, and everybody laid the same way. So this was an old custom that was borrowed from that of the Greeks, and so who seem to have picked up it from Asia Minor. If you go over to Amos chapter 6 and verse 7, there are those there who allowed lounging on that of their couches and so forth, laying around on those, and the prophet condemns them. So this manner of eating required that one have a large enough house to contain a sizable dining room. Outdoor eating areas were also fashionable, but most of them ate on the inside. And servants would bring in the food, and they'd clear the tables, and the food had to be cut into bite-sized portions. You know, those people are lazy, I guess. So, the guests could not use knives from dispositions, and forks had not yet been invented. The only fork you had would be your fingers, I guess, but you weren't supposed to eat that way. Well, that's what they did. They put them in bite size so they could pick them up and eat them. But the Roman dining room was called a triclinium. And if I want you to look up here, those on the line, right up here, I'm going to see if I can draw this again. Let me see. Let me get the black one. And this is the way. Well, I got it right there. See if I got it right here. You can see that. I can see it from last week. can't see it that good now. That round circle is the table. Okay, and this is the way they would lay 3, 2, 1. And 1, 2, 3. And 1, 2, 3. So you'd have 9 people around that one table. And they'd be reclining and they'd be reaching over on the table and they would be getting that of their food. So this is the way that these 3 people reclined together on the couch with 3 couches were normally arranged around a table in the following manner. And that's the manner in which these sofas would be arranged. And so they would lay on those things. Hey, Jim. I figured you was lounging around on your sofa there. So. Couch A, oh, what happened here? Uh-oh. Something's happened. Okay. Couch A would be occupied by the host. Uh-oh. I didn't do that, did I? This is A, this is B, and this is C. Couch A would be occupied by the host and his wife and any other family members present. B and C would be reserved for their guests. So you can see basically, and I hope you can see it. You see that, Jim? Barely. Okay. I can't hear you, so I don't guess you must be moving. And so they would reserve those position 3 on couch B was the head of the table. Okay. And so when we stop and we think about Jesus and them eating, then, we have the Lord's Supper, and so we need to make sure we understand the Lord's Supper vision that we have is what the person painted. Okay. That wasn't really the way that they would go about doing things like that. But he who reclines on the lowest on the middle couch, that place was reserved for the honored guests. And so he would be the middle couch. And what I say, let me go back and see if I can find where that was. The middle couch, the lowest. So the middle, this would be the middle, would it not? He doesn't give me the numbers there, so that's basically what he says. The position A1, way up there, will be taken by the host. In early Rome, the women sat by their husbands' feet or on the chair. But by Jesus' day, they reclined along with the men. And so with large couches, as many as 18 people could eat from one table. If there were more guests than could be accommodated at one table, other tables and couches would be set up. So we see here just 9, but if the couches were big, then, more people would sit on them and recline. So everyone in that day knew what position was assigned the most status, but they knew when they come in that they didn't sit here, okay, or even here. They knew that when they would come in, because again, A1 position would be taken by the host, and so they knew not to sit in that. So one of the guests of Petronius is in his satar was offended when Trimalchio impetuously invited the cook to join the party, and the cook, a servant, took a place above the guest, and it was obviously that he was embarrassed to someone to think that he was one of the more important personages. In other words, if you're sitting here, you're going to be put up here. No, you can't do that. And so that's basically what they did. Take your Bibles and go to Luke 14. And we'll find during the social days of Jesus, as we would say, the practice. Luke 14. I'm going to let it lay down there, and I can read without putting my glasses on and all. Beginning verse 7 says, and he put forth a parable to those which were bidden, when he marked how they chose out the chief rooms, saying unto them, when thou art bidden of any man to a wedding, sit not down in the highest room, lest a more honorable man than thou be bidden of him. And he that bade thee and him come and say to thee, give this man place, and thou wast shamed to take the lowest room. But when thou art bidden to go and sit in the lowest room, and when he that bade thee cometh, he may say unto thee, Friend, go up higher, then shalt thou have worship in the presence of them that sit at meat with thee. For whosoever exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. Now then he says, Then said he also to them that bade him, When thou makest a dinner or supper, call not thy friends, nor thy brethren, neither thy kinsmen, nor thy rich neighbors, lest they also bid thee again, and the recompense be made. But when thou makest a feast, call the poor, the maimed, and the lame, and the blind, and thou shalt be blessed, for they cannot recompense thee, for thou shalt not recompense at the recompensed at the resurrection of the just. So you can see the point there. You just simply, when you walk in, you don't take this position, you take the lower position, and so on. And so, and then not only that, but if you invite someone and they're going to recompense you, he says best thing to do is invite the poor, because they can't do that. And I don't know about y'all, but I mean, I've had people where, I've invited them over to my house to eat, and so they invite me over their house to eat, and they're just, repaying. Well, let me put it this way. I had a fellow one time I helped clean off his garden spot, helped him plant his garden. Well, I had my own garden. My wife's father, my father-in-law, got sick. We had to tend to his garden, which is 20 miles away. And so we didn't need anybody else's garden. Well, he planted stuff for me. And he got upset when I didn't come over and get it, but he didn't have to do that. And so on. Yes. Carrie.
Oh, you mentioned earlier that was a Roman practice?
Yes.
But it was also a Jewish practice as well?
Yes. This is what they did. It was a Roman, like a Greek practice, and Roman Greek practice, and everybody did this one, basically. He says, by Jesus, the women began to recline. In the Roman days, the women would sit down at their feet. Maybe in front, would be in front, they'd probably be behind or some way. But he says eventually what happened in Jesus' day, the women would recline with them. And so, like he was trying to tell us, Ovid there was trying to point that out to us, that they were close together. So basically, he says, when you are invited, go and sit or recline in the Greek at a lower place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Our friend, move up higher." So, and I guess probably some of us have gone to some people's house, and we're going to sit down off to the side. They say, "Oh, no," and they put you up at the head of the table. And I've had that happen to me. And I don't like to sit at the head of the table. I do it in my house. We go out to eat. I always sit so I can look at the door. I don't want nobody coming in on me. So, But there's another dinner party, and it's amazing that we read these passages and we don't really think about the customs and what they're doing. But go to Luke 7. And in Luke chapter 7, there's another one of these, beginning in verse 36. He says, and one of the Pharisees, now it's the Pharisees this time, he points out some more stuff, desires him that he would eat with them, and he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. And behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment, and stood at his feet behind him, weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kiss his feet, and anoint him with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee, which had bidden him, saw it, he spake within himself, saying, now he says, now you have to remember, there's this passage in John 2 verse 25, Jesus knew their thoughts. He can know, he being the Christ, he can know what people were thinking. But it says, he's saying that when the Pharisee which had bid him saw it, he spake with himself, saying, this man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that touches him, for she is a sinner. Okay? And Jesus answering said unto him, Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee. And he said, Master, say on. He says, there was a certain creditor who had, which had two debtors. One owed 500 pence and the other 50. And when they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him most? Simon answered and says, I suppose he to whom forgave most. And he said unto him, thou hast rightly judged. And he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, seest thou this woman? I entered into thy house. Thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, have not ceased to kiss my feet. My head was with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman have anointed my feet with the ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loveth much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. And he said unto her, thy sins are forgiven. And they that sat at meat with him began to say within themselves, who is this that forgiveth sins also? And he said to the woman, thy faith hath saved thee. Go in peace. Now you see the point there. That here he is. He's at the home of Simon the Pharisee. And during this meal, they basically, she washes his feet with her tears and dries them with her hair. Now, King James, the Revised Standard Version, both describe Jesus as sitting at the table in the Pharisee's house, and the woman that's standing behind him at his feet. But if Jesus was sitting in a chair, how could the woman have been standing behind him at his feet? Right? So must one imagine a terribly awkward scene like one of the from a children's Bible storybook. Here he's sitting in the chair and she's trying to wash his feet. He's sitting up at the table with a chair. So how in the world could that happen? The idea is the sense that he's still lying. And again, they would lie on their left hand, on the sofa on the left, and they would reach to get their feet. Their feet was on this side of the lounge. They on this side, their feet would be over here. They're reaching over to get the food. Here, so she came in and washed his feet. Now, if we would say that this is the way we understand it. Now, if they sit around the other way or had their feet the other way, they would have to. I don't know how they would do that. But there's a picture in the book of Jesus sitting at the table and she's washing his feet over here, with his feet sticking out on the couch. He's just sitting there. But that's kind of nonsense. Jesus was reclining on the sofa, the couch. That's what is said by the Greek verb that is used there. And the translators of the NIV are to be commended for translated accurately. It's about the only thing they transferred accurately. This meant that his feet were protruding behind him. So the woman would have had no difficulty in tending to him. In other words, if he's sitting here and he's leaning over to the table, he's got his own leaning on his left elbow, because that's what they did, it said, then they'd reach over like his feet would be over here. Now, they said it about the NIV. I have the modern literal version, and so I'm very curious about what the modern literal version says there in Luke chapter 7. Let me get there. I have it in the book of Acts because that's where I was reading today. Luke 7. It has to catch up. The modern literal version is free if you ever want to get it out. It's a literal translation by members of the church. It says, well, entered the house, he reclined at a meal. The woman who was a sinner, after recognized that he is reclining at a meal in the Pharisee's house, she fetched an alabaster flask of perfume and having stood beside his feet behind him. Got it? Behind him. So the modern little version has him. He's sitting there with his elbow reaching and his feet's over here and she's behind him. I have to tell Brother Walker that's a pretty good translation. And so it's sometimes it's good that if you have a computer, I don't know how many of y'all have computers when you study your Bible, but sometimes it's good when you have one, if you got different translations, that you open them up. And if you the modern literal version of the Bible, the New Testament and Old Testament, now they're working on the Old Testament, they're free at modernliteralversion.org. And you get them free. You get them for your cell phone also. It would have been easy for the woman to slip into the house unnoticed because the other guests had their servants with them, and the number of people milling around in the house would have been considerable. And so servants normally stood behind their masters and ready to attend to their need, even bringing them chamber pots during dinner, according to Marshall. That's what he said that they did. And so to accompany them home and to carry leftovers from the meal, guests were expected to bring their own napkins to a meal and were free to take reasonable amounts of food home with them. So Marshall complains about a guest who swept practically everything off the table and passed it back to his servant. Says, if you have any shame, the poet says, put it back. But I didn't invite you to dinner tomorrow. so that's pretty good. I didn't invite you for tomorrow. I invited you today. So we should also envision Jesus and his disciples reclining even at the Lord's Supper. Over in Mark's account, in Mark 14 and verse 15, I'm going to read the King James and I'll get the modern literal version. He says in Mark 14 and verse, let me see if I got it right here, verse 15, he says, and wheresoever he shall say in, say ye at the goodman of the house, the master saith, where is the guest chamber, where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? We should envision Jesus there. He's reclining, even in Luke chapter, Matthew, Mark, Luke chapter 22. We find that Luke records for us down in verse 12. He puts it this way. He says, he shall show you a large upper room furnished there, make ready. And so specifically at the place where they had shared the meal was a large upstairs room. So there would have been space for couches and a table and so forth, as we have seen right here, because that's the way they set things up. And we would find there are several Greek words in the New Testament that means to recline at a table. The most frequent one used is the word, and I'm going to spell it for you in Greek, Keimai, Keimai, which actually means to lay down. And Lawrence, I see you joined us. I haven't got your test graded yet, so I'll get it to you soon. I'll get it to you before the end of the quarter. Is that all right? I think he's just, okay. To lie down is what the root word means. And then there's a root word pipto, P-I-P-T-O, means to fall. So the verb anapipto might be something like to throw oneself down or to flop down. So we probably won't see it translated that way in any publication of the version of the New Testament, though, to mean to flop down. But a third verb is the word chemo, kalino, and its compounds. It means to lean or to recline and is used only by that of Luke. And so you have the word kata klino. And so if someone was reclining next to Jesus, we could conclude that Jesus was not occupying the position of honor. So a glance basically of our diagram shows that the person in position B3 right here, could not have been someone reclining close to his breast, as John 13 verse 23 says, but Jesus was the host for this dinner, acting as head, as we would say, for a traditional Jewish Seder meal, and would have been in position A1. So he'd be here, and the guest of honor was here. And so John, the beloved disciple, would have to be in A2 in order to be next to Jesus. And let's see, none of the synoptic gospels provides much details, but according to John 13:24 in the Revised Standard Version, Peter beckoned to the disciple next to Jesus and urged him to ask Jesus to identify his betrayer. Now, was Jesus in position A3, able to converse quietly with John? Here is Jesus, here is John, and we'll say here's Peter. So was he able to talk to him without, messing up? Or was he across the table here in couch C so that he could signal to get John's attention to place a piece of dipped bread to Judas, which he could have done easily if Judas was in the other spot close to him in B3 position of honor. So many Jews then reclined at the table, and like the Greeks and the Romans. Now, I say many, the point said when we say many, and Kerry asked the question a while ago, was this the whole way they did it all the time? That was the practice. Now, again, they all of them may not have practiced, but among the Romans and the Greeks, and you just have to remember, and I think all of us have seen enough of the Greek movies and so forth that we've seen, and we've seen them do this. And so But among the Jewish people, then they had adopted that way. Now, again, since this is what we would say is Greek culture, we find that the Jews had accepted this way. There's not all of them, we would say, but most of them accepted this way to meet. And so they would recline at the table. Even when they were not in the presence of the Romans and were celebrating the most ancient Jewish rituals, a group of devout Jews like Jesus and his disciples chose the manner of eating instead of a more typical. So even the Eastern habit of sitting on the floor. Hellenization, that was the Jewish people out in the Greek communities, affected the serving of the Passover meal and the conversation that went on during it. It came to resemble, to some extent, one person said, to the extent the symposium of the Greeks. It was eaten in a reclining position and was the setting for important discourses on a set theme. So they did adapt that. So again, it shows that what we have found out now, like we're studying the New Testament world in here, then in the class at Fayetteville, and some of you may be taking the class here on biblical archaeology, but I don't know how Brother Burke's teaching the class over there. At Fayetteville, we've tried to see that some of the things that the Jewish people inherited and the way that they did things were because other people were doing them. And so that became part of their culture also. And the same thing happens in the New Testament because, again, Ezra, Nehemiah, and so forth, they're scattered abroad. And they stayed that way for nearly 400 years. And all of a sudden on the day of Pentecost, you see those 15 nations, right? Jewish people come from 15 nations. Well, if you just look at Acts chapter 2, 15 nations. Yeah, the 15 nations that are there, we'll say. And then you turn to Acts chapter 6, and there's a problem. And the problem is between the Judean Jewish people and the Hellenistic Jewish people. The Jewish people of Jerusalem, Judea, was taking care of the widows, but the Hellenistic widows were not being taken care of. And so we find there was a problem. I mean, why is it they showed any type of partiality between them? Why weren't they taking care of them? They were Jewish people, but they had different things that they would do. They had picked up some of this Greek culture. And so if the Jews modified things as so basic as their eating pattern and the observance of the Passover, we must be safe in concluding that they also influenced by other facets of the Greco-Roman life. By the time we get into the book of Acts and also Paul's letters, the cultural background is Roman, not Jewish. And much of what we know about the Roman number or manner of living can be applied directly to the New Testament. I think sometimes when people read, like for instance, if we were studying the book of Romans, Romans chapter 1, he talks to that of the Gentile people. Romans chapter 2, he talks to the Jewish people. Romans chapter 3, kind of mixed up there. Chapter 4 through 6, he basically talks to them as a group of people, as a church. And then in chapter 7, he specifies the Jewish people. He talks to people there about the law, you know. And so sometimes people get that mixed up if they try to apply some things that applies to the Jews that like he does in Romans chapter 7. Then next we have, as we continue to look at some of these manners and customs and so forth, is the housing and the urban life of the people. All over the ancient world, and I'm going to go to my book, Brother Ferguson's book. He had some comment, and I'll break my book back right now in a minute. I'm going to read what he says because we're going to talk about housing and urban life. And he says in his book, he says, private houses in the eastern province were one family dwellings 4 stories high. The dining room on the top floor, if you're going to eat, you got to go up. That's what I thought. On the top floor was the only large room and often open on a terrace. This is the upper room, Acts chapter 1, verse 13, Acts 9, 37 and 39, and Acts chapter 20 and verse 8, Mark chapter 14 and verse 15. It's the upper room. That's where they were. They were actually, as we would simply say, the dining room. They were in the dining room. And so dining rooms, especially those under Roman influence, had a table in the center for food and 3 surrounding couches for the dinners to recline, for which the room takes its name, triclinum. The main couch was opposite the entrance. Okay? And so there you see basically what we've already drawn. And so, and he talks more about this as he goes through his book. I'm actually down on the wrong thing. My book falls apart. And so all over the ancient world, housing varied. And so, but here among them, that very top room of 4 stories high, that was a dining room, the upper room. And so, you know, some people, and we have some people, when I first came into the church, I mean, you know, I listened to, hey.
I just gonna tell you, I was upstairs, but y'all be here at 8:30?
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
I'll be gone.
Okay.
You coming Saturday?
I can't make it, sorry.
Well, I'd love you to
But,
come.
yeah, next time you do one, I'll come.
Well, you got 8, you gonna be out of town.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
hope the next time you come, even if nothing else to eat, so. I got a lot of
yeah,
fun.
one of these part, what you're doing.
Well, hopefully, you know, they inspire me. Y'all, sorry, I interrupted.
That's all right.
And you can give me an assignment to do during the upcoming week and I can.
I'll get you.
Okay.
I appreciate it, buddy. Y'all have a good night.
You too. When I first came into the church, I listened, you know, because you're thinking you're leaving a denominational world, and you're becoming a member of the Lord's church, and you figure everything's done the same way everywhere. And so I learned about there was a group of people in the church that believed that you had to meet in the upper room. And so now, since I understand that it's the 4th floor, I'm just wondering if they had 3 floors under them. Because if you're going to bind, you know, something that's not bound where you meet, but you're going to say, no, we got to meet in the upper room, take the Lord's Supper, you know, then it has to be up on the 4th floor. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting, and it's good to know now. I mean, you know, about those things. But the size and the arrangements of dwellings in the ancient city, however, were influenced by the crowding that characterized all the urban life of that time. Now, just imagine on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, all these people, and my estimation is something like 1 million people came into Jerusalem. And so there had to be a crowded place. These cities had originally been confined within defensive wall. Luxury such as yards and public parks had no place when living space was so severely restricted. Houses, shops were jammed up next to one another, sharing walls like rows in the modern cities, and one would find open space with grass and a few trees only in connection with a temple or a public bath. Now, when I say public bath, that's what I mean, public bath. They took a bath naked, and they come out of their pool naked, and they grabbed their towel and wiped themselves off. And so here was a part that was donated by a civic-minded aristocrat, according to Pliny, and that's what they would do. But the quality of life in a large city, and most of us, we've seen, you know, because we have all these movies and stuff like Law and Order, and they show these big old cities, and that's what we see, you know, and probably not many that we used to, but we would see businesses, and their business was on the bottom floor, and they lived up here on the top. Now, I remember in my lifetime, or as a young person, that grocery stores in Cartersville, you could go and people have a grocery store up front, but they lived in the back. And they didn't carry everything, but, you know, there's a small grocery store like right in the community. Like today, we have 7-Eleven, just about 3 on every corner. You come up to the intersection, you got one on each corner. But back then, they just have one in a little area. On Etowah Drive there, we had 2 stores. From the time that you leave downtown there, the time you get to the Indian Mounds, there was 2 stores. There was a Triangle Grocery, and then there was, I forget what this lady called, but it was the room. We're sitting in here in this room here, and it might have been a third of this, but she carried milk, bread, and candy and stuff like that, basically the necessities. So you wouldn't have to go to town all the time, because the only way we had to go was walk. And so, but we could see in those larger cities, you know, that they would live upstairs or maybe live in the back. And today we do have some of those people from other countries that, you know, have 7-Eleven stores and they stay in the back. I try to avoid those myself because they don't smell too good, you know. So the quality of life, the constant noise and the difficulty of sleeping in rooms that were hot in the summer and cold in the winter seemed to have kept people's nerve on edge. I remember when I went to Rigolatti, like I say when I talk about going there, is that it was like I saw movies of what was the name of that group of Robert Stack played, The Untouchables, you know, back like in those days. And you walked into that Latvian world, and that's the way it was. So you walked in and you looked at that type of thing, and places were actually they were crowded and so forth, and so all these different things that would be taking place just in that area, and they lived in those places. And so we were staying with a Russian family, myself and Brother Stephen Law, and I kept hearing stuff at night like, Jim would know this. Sometimes colored guards would wear taps on their shoes, right? And boy, you hear clink, 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 every night. And I'm sitting there, and this is my first time to go leave the United States since Vietnam. And so, clink, clink, clink. And I said, man, they marching around here, and Latvia's just had gotten their freedom, from the Russians. And so I'm sitting there, and I didn't sleep. The 21 days I was there, I didn't sleep good at all. And I got back. I said, I'm not going back. But after being there about 2 weeks, I found out what that was. Anybody want to guess what that was? That word, all that noise I was hearing were the prostitutes coming in from wherever they had been. We was on the first floor, lived on the first floor. This Russian on the third floor was where the prostitutes were. That's where they would assemble and meet their date, go get their dates, and that's where they'd come back to. And they'd all come back together with them high heels, all the way down. So I said, well, y'all could have found us a better place, but that's where the member of the church lived, and so that's where he had to live as a Russian. He was a Russian, so he had to live there. But you can imagine the noise and everything that's going on, and my nerves were on edge too, as it says in the book about because of all of that. But police forces didn't exist. I saw the military when I was there, so people had to really protect themselves the best way that they could. But though burglars seem not to have been deterred by the inadequate security devices of that day, so violence was an epidemic because it was usually the only resource one had to right in wrongs that they had suffered. So if the city was dangerous during the day, it became a absolute no man's land by night. So Atlanta, Georgia. You go to Atlanta, we went to a ball game and we got ready to leave. The only people you saw on the street were people coming from the ball game, Braves ball game. That was in overtime or playing extra innings. Overtime would have been football. But that's all you saw. You didn't see anybody walking down the street. Everybody was in automobiles. And so Juvenal, the historian says that only a fool would go out after dark without having him up to date. And so he goes on to say, this is freedom for a poor man after being beaten and cut up by attackers' blows. He begs and pleads to be allowed to go home with a few teeth. So that's how bad it was in some of those places. So the citizens of any ancient city would be certainly have been sympathetic with the Americans. Take back the night movement, whenever that was. Never heard of it myself, but I guess it was something with it. Because I lived in a small town of Cartersville, and we'd ride our bicycles 10, 12 o'clock at night on the streets and everything, and police would look after you. But in Rome, as probably in modern Manhattan, when the book was written, because of the expense of that of the land, in the capital city, the average person lived in large apartment houses, usually shabbily built and reportedly maintained by a landlord looking for profits in his investment. I've often wondered, because of when I've gone to Washington, and we would go and we'd park our car. We stay way outside Washington, D.C., and we would go drive our car to the MARTA, not MARTA, but whatever, Metro, to the Metro place. And then we'd get on. Well, we get on, we'd go down to there, and we'd talk to them. They don't even own cars. I'm sitting there, you mean tell me you don't own a car? How do you get around? Well, everything's right close to the neighborhood. I either walk or get a cab or ride the Metro. I said, sure. I don't see how you can live without a car. Well, they have a lot of taxes. So. But can you imagine that? And so because they all live in apartments. And we stayed in a place over close to Arlington Cemetery. And we got to see the cemetery that way by staying there. But it's a nice place. We stayed right next to the interstate. And when we come down, I think it was about the 7th or 10th floor, something like that. When we come down, you had McDonald's, another place there. And you had a big cafe there. And you had a grocery store there. Everything's right there. That you really needed. And for if you didn't have an automobile. So when we got ready to go to church services, we actually got a cab carry us over there, and some members of the church brought us back home. And then on Wednesday night or Sunday night and Wednesday night, they come and got us, brought us home. But fire was a big problem during this time. Before Augustine's time, Augustus' time, Rome had no firefighting force, and so the best Augustus could institute was a system of night watchmen who were supposed to wake people up from to form bucket brigades and to stop the fires. Now, Juvenal, he pities the poor man on the top of the top floor of a tenement. Here's what he says, and I'm going to just read what he said. He calls it the poor housing for the poor. We live in a city propped up for the most part on slender reeds. The landlord may stand in the front of the building even as it's falling down and cover up a crack in the ancient wall. Then he'll tell you to sleep soundly, though the building is about to collapse. It's better to live out where there are no fires, no reason to be afraid at night. Here, one neighbor is calling for water while another bundles his shabby goods to safety. The third floor of your abode is already smoking, but you don't know it. If an alarm is sounded on the lower floors, you'll be the last to burn. Up there, where only the tiles protect you from the rain and where the gentle doves cover their eggs. So you can imagine. So, when I was in Vietnam, and like I guess other countries that have gone through wars, it was very, they lived just about nothing. We would go in, but a lot of people were clean, but can you imagine being clean on a dirt floor? But I'm talking about you'd go into their places and that floor was clean. It was dirty because it was dirt, but it was clean. I'm not talking about there weren't rocks and it was smooth and all that kind of stuff. And even where many of them had holes dug down in the ground like a foxhole, and even that was clean. They were clean in reference to that. You want to raise your hand? You just speak because there is a chat thing there. You want to chat?
No, I don't know if anybody else is having a problem, but you're cutting in and out on us again. I don't know if Jim or anybody's having a problem hearing you, but
you having a problem, Jim?
He's good.
You're good?
He's okay.
Okay. I didn't know if it was just us or you.
Do I need to cut myself up or? Let me see.
Turn
How's that? Is that any better?
Well, I'll let you know if it gets bad again. I just keep losing your voice, and I'm like, what'd you say? You freeze, and I'm like, I have no idea what you just said.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
But even in places like the war-torn places, we find that it becomes a problem. I mean, the way that they would have to live, and sometimes it's heartbreaking to go there, but to see that. Many people seem really to be unwilling to use the public latrines. That might be California, I guess, at inconvenient times. They resorted to chamber pits, which then had to be emptied, and the landlords were required to keep slop jars in the halls of their buildings, but few did, and most people disposed of their waste by dumping it out the window. And you think about that. Juvenal says that having a chamber pot emptied on one's head was a minor inconvenience compared to being hit by a brick falling from a decrepit building. But other types of garbage were also tossed into the street and alleys of the cities. And again, when we went to Latvia, some places were clean and some places were not. And so rain would eventually wash all that stuff into the sewers, and that's what would happen over there. And we're going to get some rain, so if we have any dirty places in Bartow County, we're going to wash them away this week because we're going to get some rain tonight. It's coming in from Alabama. So all these similar cities, which did not have a luxuries as sewers, and be honest with you now, they in some places in Vietnam, in the big cities like Saigon or something like that, they had them, but in the smaller cities, they didn't have those things. And a luxury like sewers, but many of those places would have high health problems. According to Pliny, he described a town in his province, Bithynia, which is a New Testament town when we read the Bible, he says, as elegant and well laid out. But right through the middle of its main street runs something called a stream, which is actually an extremely foul sewer. It's disgusting to look at, he goes on to say, and is unhealthy because of the odor which it emits. So he proposed, and Trajan, who was in charge at that time, approved that of covering the stream to make a proper sewer. And so that's what they did, and they made a sewer. And so, but a lot of places, I mean, when you travel overseas, a place like that, you go into places and you think they're going to have all the convenience of America. That's not the case. You know, and I guess that's the reason why some counselors suggest that if we have family problems, we take our family camping. You know, and best thing to do, the rougher camping is better, they say. In other words, where you have to put the tent up, collect the wood, empty the pot, and all that kind of, or dig a place, or whatever you have to do. You do everything. It makes the family a better family, according to those who do counseling, and they suggest that to families who are having problems. We know from a census that there are only about 1,000 private homes in Rome, according to the census that they looked at, compared to over 14,000 apartment buildings. So even tradesmen and shopkeepers like Priscilla and Aquila, Romans 16 verse 5, could not afford to own a private house. Their house was in all likelihood an apartment, perhaps one which took up most of all of one floor of a building. The ground floors of these large apartment buildings were given over to shop. The people lived at the top. Priscilla and Aquila probably had a shop in the building where they lived, and if they did not live in a portion of the shop itself, a typical apartment had 3 rooms, a central living room, dining room, and a bedroom. And so this, and not some luxury villa, is likely to have been the sort of house in which the early Christian groups gathered. So they would gather. Now, I do understand in Vietnam, South Vietnam, where the church is, that 15 to 20 people meet in houses. So you can't be over 20. If they have over 20, they're reported to the government, because they say they can't have them. Even when they baptize someone, they baptize them in something like a 35-gallon or 55-gallon drum. They go down in, and they push the head under, and then they come back up. And so, but that's how they meet. So the same would be the truth there. They would meet in houses. They didn't have places to meet like we do. Now, out in the Hellenistic world, where the Greeks were, they had synagogues. And so they would meet in the synagogues too. But in towns like other towns in Italy, Pompeii and Herculaneum, I think is what he says his name, apartment houses are also found, though none so large as those in Rome. And so beginning around the 2nd century AD, under the influence of these Greek city planners, now we like planners, okay, where they go in and they would plan a city. These large apartment houses became common in the Near East and did luxurious private homes similar to those in Greece and Italy. And in the words of the archaeologist Beebe, he said, the impact of Greek culture upon the people of Palestine was stunning. So remote villages may have escaped the Hellenization, but city life was revolutionized at that time. The archaeologists in Palestine have traditionally given more attention, Beebe says, to fortifications of cities, the palaces of kings and governors, the complexities of temples, and some other buildings. And until recently, little attention had been given to how ordinary people lived in the biblical days. And that situation is changing, and the result shows that the life in Judah in the 1st century AD was a little different from anywhere else in the Roman Empire. Now, we're not given really any sense of that. When you turn to Acts 20 there, where they take the Lord's Supper, and Paul, he preaches, and there's a large gathering there. So, the housing was probably pretty good in Troas. And so the roof served some of the functions of the garden in a wealthy man's house, and allowed the family to get fresh air and sunshine without standing in the street. And we've probably seen the movies, up in Boston and places like that, where people go up to the top. And up at the top, it sticks like as we would say, a porch up there, a deck. It's fixed like that way up there. And people go up there and they have parties and stuff like that, because there they get sunshine, and plus they're away from all that noise, which is all the way down at the bottom. You can see that taking place. On muggy nights, people would even sleep on the roof, Mark 13, verse 15. And there was also large, expensive homes in Judea, and which they even had running water, bathrooms, and large dining rooms. As the New Testament clearly shows, and in Mark 13, verse 34, some houses would require large numbers of servants. So the more servants you had, probably the bigger the house was. Now, I don't know how most of you were brought up, but I lived in Cartersville, and we lived out on Etowah Drive, about a mile, 2 miles from Indian Mounds, and we was, before it became Indian Mounds, it was Indian Mounds, but before it became a park. And we lived on a dirt road, and we didn't have running water, and we didn't have inside plumbing, and we had outside bathroom. And we had to draw our water from a well that was in our front yard. And after we got it all paved, and Etowah Indian Mounds became a museum, I think more water got out of that well because we eventually got water, but people would come by and we had to keep a bucket and a gourd dipper down there so people would stop and get a drink of fresh water. They'd stop and say, can we draw some water? Can we draw some water? The people from up north come down and want to draw some water. But that's how we was raised. I mean, it was, I forget how old I was before I think I went to high school when I had my first shower, because we always took a bath from a basin, or then sometimes we'd fill up a mama's wash tub, rinse water and stuff like that, and we'd fill it up, stick it out there and let it get hot. And then we got running water, but we didn't have any inside plumbing, so we'd take the water hose and put it over the line, like that, and let it come out, and we'd take a shower. We'd always had something like curtains around us outside, so we made do. The first reference to a house in the New Testament is in the, as he calls it, the Christmas story, as recorded in Matthew. Contrary to popular invention, imagine of the wise men, the number 3 is nowhere mentioned, but kneeling before the babe in the manger, surrounded by oxen and sheep. Matthew 2:11 says, on entering the house, they saw the child with Mary and his mother. And so it points out to us in reference to that of the house. Now, Brother Ferguson, let me see if this is a comment that I want to read. Yes. He says in his book, the beginning and end of the story of Jesus relates to the political context in which Christian movement began. He talks about everything that goes place there, and I'm going to read what he says because he mentioned this passage. He says the star followed by the Magi to Bethlehem, Matthew 2:1-12, had religio-political connotations for the religious. He tells us to go somewhere else. The appearance of a comet signaled the apotheosis of Julius Caesar after his assassination, 44 BC, and on he goes. The star of Bethlehem heralded that Jesus was born King of the Jews. His title king was the same word used as that of Herod as being for that of the emperor. But he uses Matthew 2, verse 11 there. He has a reference. In Matthew 5 and verse 15, Jesus seems to have a small house in mind when he says there, no one, after lighting the lamp, puts it under the bushel basket on the lampstand and it gives light to all in the house. So many of the people to whom he spoke probably lived in houses which could be lighted by a simple lamp. Peter's house in Capernaum, according to Mark 1 and verse 33, which archaeologists think they found that, seems to have been small since people had to crowd around the door when they walked waited on Jesus in Mark 1 and verse 33. So they did have that of houses in reference to where they met. Jesus also mingled with people on the other end of the social scale, and we've already seen that Simon the Pharisee could accommodate a large dinner party. But one day Jesus went to the house of Jairus, if you recall, to heal his daughter, and found flute players and mourners probably hired. Back then they had mourners and you hired them, and they carried on, and and so on, to make a racket, I guess is what I would say. But in Matthew 9, beginning verse 23, he says, when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. So in both of these cases, we should envision a rather large house, not unlike those we visit today in Pompey's area. So we actually have in the Gospels a couple of clues of the size of Jesus' own house. It's clear, Mark 2, verses 1-2. I'm going to go back to Brother Ferguson's book and see what he says. He talks something about, well, he just uses the passage. I'm not going to read. But in Mark chapter 2, verses 1-2, Mark 2, he says, and again he entered in Capernaum after some days, and it was noticed that he was in the house. And straightway many were gathered together, insomuch that there was no room to receive them. No, not so much as about the door, and he preached the word unto them. And so we find that the evangelist has Jesus' house in mind, Mark, that is. So it's large enough that many could gather, but eventually the crowd got too numerous for that house size. Down in verse 15, it says, it came to pass as Jesus said at meat in his house, many publicans and sinners sat also together with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many, and they followed him. So he must have had a pretty big sized house. So we actually see Jesus having dinner in his house. And how many times have we read that and never just stopped to think about that Jesus was having dinner in his own house, or the house of his parents, we would say. Whether it was his or Matthew's is not really clear. The house, in reference to the house, but what was going on there, the inference it seems that it was Jesus' house is more natural than all the scholars would agree with that conclusion. Some people argue and say that it's not, that most likely it was Matthew's house because he was a tax collector and he had money, and therefore he had a big house. But the disciples by themselves would have a good-sized dinner party, especially when we recall that the term disciples applies to his followers, not just to the 12. Sometimes people say, well, his disciples, that's the 12. That's not always true. You have to make sure you read the context. Okay, I have 7:30, so we're going to take a break. Okay? Take a break. Drink your coffee. I drink my tea.
Pretty interesting material there. I hadn't heard any, well, I heard about the reclining, that's all, but I heard very little about reclining other than reclining.
Yeah.
There was a Moroccan restaurant down in Atlanta that I've been to several times, a long time ago. When you went in there, they put you on a little autumn, sit in a circle, and they sit in the middle, and they bring the food out, and you have no eating utensils. And you eat everything with your hand, and some of it's like mashed potatoes. You have dates, and so you're going to have a hand that's going to be messy. Not everything is, dry stuff that you're eating. And they give you a towel, and you put this towel over your left shoulder, and you eat with the right hand on. I say that's because in the desert, there's no water. You have to go to the bathroom. So this is the hand that you wipe yourself with, and this is the hand you eat with, and you don't get them confused. So the towel goes on this shoulder, and you wipe your hands on this towel.
I added that,
Then you eat,
Yeah.
and say this.
That's pretty neat.
You got a hold of me. I'm supposed to close on my house tomorrow, but my rental house, I haven't heard from them.
You selling or?
Yeah, I'm selling my rental house. I'm just tired of messing with it. Told it cheap. That's what I told me today.
I don't know what that is. It's kind of like an old Christmas tree stand.
Oh, I bet that, is that for the abortion thing? Put sign on for the abortion thing?
I think this is usually like a teenager's class.
It is.
You know, it's amazing to me. People on the TV get so upset about some things that seem so minor and don't care a thing about abortion. You know, it's like we're going to get all up in arms about something somebody said or something.
You remember about the whale
Oh, yeah.
out? You know, we had to do this, we didn't get all this money to save the whale. Well, go back to abortion. I had, I spoke, preaching at Rockmart to preach to Justin Mason, student from school, I moved there. And I preached Sunday morning on the value of the soul. So I got through, had one of the members, which she was a member of the church, Cartersville, not for Full Gospel. She came to me, she said, she didn't know who I was. She didn't know who I was until she asked me. She said, told her daughter was part of it. She said, I hadn't seen Bobby that long since last time I seen he had red hair. And so she asked me a question about abortion. And I made an illustration, and she didn't, I guess she didn't follow it. I told her, I said, you can't take dead and make living. In other words, the sperm of a woman is living, and the egg of a woman is living, and the sperm of a man is living. You put the two living things together, and you have a soul. It's a life. Therefore, if it's a life, then it's a soul. A soul becomes a soul, and it's what come to find out what.
I haven't heard that argument before.
Yeah, that's when the soul is. That's when you become a living soul. It's like God breathing in the nostrils, air. He hardly begin to beat the body begin to work. The body begin to form when they go together. You got two living matters come together and make life. And so that's when the soul is also. And the Mormons think there's a room up there somewhere, and when that happens, that God takes somebody that's living life before, whatever life before, and that comes down to the one that's
Kind of like reincarnation.
well, reincarnation is false doctrine for that. No, it's not that. Reincarnation is you've already lived on the earth. Right here is you've already lived in heaven with God, and He's trained you to come there.
Oh, even for the
It's
first time.
basically
For the first time.
yeah. And so she told me, she said, well, I'm just concerned about it. And I said, well, it's just like this. I said, you have to stop and think when women with children and they have a miscarriage. If not, as the person saying that it's the soul once it comes out of the womb. The Bible points out this that God made him in the womb. So God made him in the womb of they are life.
One of those sermons is on abortion.
Yeah, I saw it. Yeah, I preached one time on that, talked about Jeremiah, talked about being in the womb. Because you don't into the church.
Now today, because of what people are doing, so
Yeah.
time to speak on it.
Oh, yeah. Who told me this reason? I saw it on Facebook somebody spoke.
So Neil, our preacher did it in a devotional. I think he did it in a sermon.
So now, is he still working with the church full time and doing counseling, or?
Yeah.
Somebody asked me, and I said, well, I think he is.
Yeah, he's definitely.
I don't think he went back to school to be certified and everything. That's what they tried to get me to do when I moved back here. I went to New York State, or college and say, Mom's good and I both. They said, you got to take your courses from us. I said, I'm not going back to school. I had enough of college. Well, to be certified, you got to ask me. I said, I don't have to be certified to work through the church. That's right. If they would accept my counseling psychology degree from Troy, they wouldn't take me course. No. I've had enough of school. Okay. Back.
You get to school every single day. And the way you study all the time.
Yeah. It's amazing. Sometimes these fellows from overseas and other places will write, so what are you doing? I call them, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm busy. I had one old fellow tell me, you say busy all the time. Well, you're not busy, call me. And I said, well, okay. So I didn't call him. I said, I'll be honest with you. I said, my wife tells me I'm busier now than I was when I was in full-time work. So I told the elders, one of the elders last night, I said, I'm getting through with 2 Thessalonians. What do y'all want me to do when I get through? I said, who's going to teach the class? Because I'm going to be gone probably all of June. And I said, y'all already said you wanted to, let somebody else teach. And I said, he said, oh, well, you go ahead and teach up to when you get ready to leave. Okay. I said, in other words, you want me to teach 1st and 2nd Timothy or something? He said, well, you can start it. You start it. All right.
What do you want?
We're going to, Bobby and Reba Wood and Linda and I are going to, in the last Sunday, Memorial Day, we're going to go to see the Ark and see the Creation Science Museum, in Kentucky and Ohio. And then in June, we're trying to figure out, we got, it's being in the military, they have the Armed Forces, what do they call it? Vacation Club. And they got a sale going on. You can buy 7 days in a resort for $349 and you get one free. So for $750, we can go stay 4 weeks somewhere.
Right.
So we're going to go up north if we figure it out, just according to what she can do. Okay. I was talking about Jesus, his house, and so forth. The likelihood that Jesus, or at least his family, owned a large home should not really surprise us, because Joseph was a builder, if you recall, and likely a general contractor, as we would probably look upon him. And rather than just a mere carpenter, and undoubtedly had built his own house and so forth, and they had a good house. For instance, in Mark 6 and verse 3, he uses the Greek word tekton to describe Joseph's means. There's someone who builds with wood and stone. That's what the word means. And so Jesus likely followed the same trade because he knew about planning and financing that of buildings. If you recall, in Luke chapter 14, you count the cost, verses 28 through 30. Paul says that he was rich when he began his ministry, then became poor, 2 Corinthians 8, verse 9. So maybe the concept of Jesus as a homeless, illiterate preacher has been read back too widely into the gospel text under the influence of a monastic movement beginning back in the 4th century AD. And so, but yet according to one tradition, Jesus as the Son of Man did experience rejection and homelessness at a later stage in his life. And it could be, if we were to just stop and think about it, that once he started his ministry, he may have given up all of his earthly possessions, because he was going to travel and preach and teach the word of God. We have people today that they lived in preachers' houses, and some of them owned their own houses. But as they were living in preachers' houses, some of them saved their money, and a lot of them some years ago bought motorhomes, and they do mission work. We got a place at Cartersville where they can actually pull in, and they can empty their waste, and they can hook up electricity and water if they're traveling. If they're using, I forget what they call those people at that time, but they traveled and they preached and teach the gospel, and they did vacation Bible schools, and knocking on doors in small towns in the state of Georgia. Brother Gray does that, or used to do that. I don't know if he still has his motorhome. Do you hear, Brother Bob Gray? I don't know if he still has his motorhome or not, but he used to, him and I can't think of the other brother. The other brother has passed away, that they used to do it together. But it may be that he doesn't do it that way. Most of the other references to houses in the gospel are really too vague for us to try to determine, what size. In Acts, though, we find there are a number of references to what must have been really sizable houses. Because he talks about on the day of Pentecost, he said they were all together in one place. When it sounded like a wind filled the entire house where they were sitting. Now, I understand, that's the 12, but turn over to Acts chapter 1, or Acts chapter 2, I'm sorry. And but if you go back Acts chapter 1, if you go back to Acts chapter 1, there was 120. He talks about, let's see here. Let me see. Well, in Acts chapter 2 there, he talks about, they all were in one place, and therefore there came this mighty wind that filled the house where they were staying. And so that had to be a kind of a big house if it had the 12 apostles there. And plus, if you notice, they also in Acts chapter 1 and verse 26, they were choosing somebody takes Judas's place, Matthias. And so, it had to be a pretty good sized place. And so, if the first all refers to the whole company of Christians, there were 120 of them, according to verse 15 of chapter 1. And so, if however just all the apostles, there would have been 12, and the phrase "all the house," the entire house, does seem to suggest they dwell in some size. Yet, since a crowd soon gathered, it might mean a portico of the temple where they later met at Acts chapter 3 and Acts chapter 7. That caused the temple a house. So it could have been that. So, the person would have to really search to see, is he referring to a family dwelling, or is he really referring to the temple? And I personally would probably say it was the temple. I don't think I'd say that it was the house because, again, they were there on the day of Pentecost, and that was the time to worship, be around the temple. So, but I could be wrong. My wife says I'm wrong here once in a while. Homes of Cornelius, the centurion, and Simon the tanner undoubtedly reflected, some type of power and some type of economic prosperity on their part. Simon's must have been built in the Jewish fashion, since Peter could go up on the roof to pray, Acts 10, verse 9. And on the other home of the wealthy, that of Mark's mother, is mentioned in Acts 12, verse 12. So when Peter was miraculously released from prison, he went there where many had gathered. So, and he knocked at the outer gate. So not only did they have, as we would say, a big house, because people were gathered there, but it was protected. It had a gate around it. So this would not have been the front of the house. Houses in ancient cities opened directly on the sidewalk. If there was one, or the street, in a wealthy house had a garden in the rear, almost always with a gate opening onto an alley or to a back street. So Peter was using common sense to go to the back entrance. He was an escaped prisoner and could hardly stand around on the street at the front door waiting on someone to let him in. Especially, it's amazing there the maid Rhoda, who in her joy and distraction, she didn't open the door. She left and told the others. Chapter 12, verse 14, left Peter standing at the back door. So, but that's their housing. Another thing that we cover in the book is that of clothing. And I've always thought it was interesting because years ago, we would preach sermons on modest apparel. And the idea of modest and immodest, a person should not be going around showing things that should be covered. But we would find, if you were to go back, there wasn't much distinction between women's clothing and men's clothing. There was just a small a difference in that. In Matthew 5:40, Brother Ferguson says that the chiatons is mentioned first because the context is a lawsuit in which one is sued for his garment to go to court. In Luke 6:29, it's the word hematon, is mentioned first because the context is a robbery. One strikes you, in which an assailant seizes the outer garment. So garments were very special. I'm going to go ahead and read this other part too. We're going to talk about this in a minute, and I'll try not to go back there again. But sometimes we talk about women and the clothing, that how they're supposed to adorn themselves. 1 Timothy 2:9 and 1 Peter 3 and verse 3. Portrait sculpture of the Flavian period, and that would be during the times of the Caesars and so forth, gives specificity to the type of hairstyles and jewelry that is forbidden. The braiding of the hair was very elaborate and quite unlike the simple braid of the modern times. The items mentioned in the biblical text were characteristics of the wealthy, upper class, and those who imitated them. And so he points out even the mirrors back then was just simply polished metal. When we were in Vietnam, we would want to shave, and that's what we had. Sometimes we'd have to use a piece of metal or use our tin cup and try to make it, so we could shave. Most times we did it by feeling, because if you had one of those things like that and it started hitting the sun, somebody out there would shoot you, So we had a problem with that. But mirrors were made of polished metal. Now we're going to talk about clothing, and I read what he said, but clothing carried implication of your status. We have, if that's the case today, we have some poor people. I mean, they drive nice-looking cars, and they have nice-looking glasses, and they have iPhones, but their pants got holes all in them. Have y'all seen those? Someone told me that they paid something like $50 for a pair of blue jeans that got holes in the knees and halfway up the thigh. Now, when I was a kid, my mama, I didn't want to wear a pair of pants. They had a patch on them. And she'd have to patch them, and those are the ones we wore around the house. When they got a hole in them, she'd patch them. And when we came home, we took off our school clothes or our Sunday to go meeting clothes, and we put on those old blue jeans. And sometimes they would be about 2 inches, 1 inch, or 1 inch, 2 inches short down at the bottom. But it's amazing to me that how things have changed. When I was in high school, I wore basically dress pants. That's just, my mother bought those, and that's what I would wear. I did have blue jeans, but most of the time I wore pants, not blue jeans. And we had a lot of people wear blue jeans, but I didn't. I think they were easier for my mother to keep instead of blue jeans. My mother got some of them stretchers one time, stretch them blue jeans, make the crease down the middle. So we wore them then. But clothing, like I said, it implicated social status. The reference to clothing is rare in the New Testament, simply because the writer didn't see a need really to write on that topic. But there are a few, and we can learn something by looking at some general practices of that area. The style of garments in Judea may have differed somewhat from those in Greece and Rome, but the principles on which those styles were based varied a little across the empire. Again, we have to remember the Jews are scattered abroad. Now, again, there was a plan that God had, and as this plan was being carried out, again, they are scattered abroad. They built synagogues. They took in some of the culture of the Greek people, and it's all a mixture. And the reason for that was because eventually there was going to be no distinction between male and female, between Jew and Gentile, between the slave and the free man. According to Galatians 3 and verse 28, there was not going to be any of that. And so there are the style of those garments, they just simply differ somewhat from those in the Greece and Roman, but those principles and those styles did vary. In addition, we would find that literary references we can see in their artwork, how that the Greeks and the Romans dressed. There's representations of Jews are rare, really, in ancient art because of the Old Testament prohibition against representing human figures, though some rabbis did interpret the word graven image. And so quite literally forbid any type of statues of that of the Jewish people. At least there's one synagogue in Euripus in the Mesopotamia that has numerous and colorful drawings on the walls, but it's too far east and a bit too late to provide information for the New Testament period. The mosaics on the floor of the synagogues of the synagogue of Cyprus may yield more information about the looks of the Jewish people of that day in Palestine and during the Roman period, but it has not yet been analyzed. And so again, like we talk about archaeology, they deal a lot of stuff. Most archaeology things are dealing with the Old Testament. A few archives of the other nations depict Jews, except when they are being taken captive. Now, I've been teaching about biblical archaeology class. I mean, they wore clothing that came up about to the knee. It seems when you look at some of the drawings on their walls. But the Greco-Roman clothing fell into two categories. Garments put on by wrapping them around the body, okay? Some as the Roman toga or the Greek himation were classified as amacus. These outer garments were worn on formal occasions or for warmth in the winter. And so they were cumbersome and they had to be removed when the person engaged in physical exertion. That's why the men stoning Stephen laid their coats at the feet of the young man Saul, Acts 7, verse 58. The Roman man's toga was larger and more elaborately draped than the woman's cloak. Now, they basically looked the same, except for that. That woman's cloak was known as a pallia. Let's see. Pallia. In haste, an individual would sometimes just, when you're being chased, you want to get rid of anything that's heavy. So they just throw the cloak around them, and they would take off. But sometimes they would throw them away, throw them down. Mark 14, verse 51. This young man who may have been camping in the Garden of Gethsemane, as pilgrims often did at that time, had clothed himself in that careless fashion when he came to see what all the fuss was about. And so when someone grabbed him, he slipped out of his garment and he ran away naked, according to Mark 14, verse 51. Now, cloaks, remember 2 Timothy 4, verse 13, cloaks were very expensive. And so it's necessary to have someone watch one's clothing in public places like the baths. In other words, they had these baths, they take them in public, but you had to take your clothes off to get in the bath. Not only that, but when they had a public execution. So complaints of stolen clothes were frequent, according to the people who wrote back then, and even in their poems and so forth, they wrote about things like that. Perhaps the cost of the garment was one reason why Paul told Timothy, says, look, when you come, you bring me my cloak, which I left at Troas. And so because cloth was expensive, and then stop for a moment and think, well, if it's expensive, you remember that Lydia was a seller of purple, the expensive dye to dye clothing. And so you can imagine how expensive it would have been if you dyed a piece of cloth purple. And so few people other than the wealthy own more than 2 garments at a time. Now Marshall chides one of the hosts who changed his clothes 7 or 11 times during a dinner on the pretense of being sweaty. Jesus in Matthew 10, however, says that his disciples are not to have even 2 coats, 2 clothes. Remember when he's sending them out? The more casual type of clothing, though, was classical and inductus, is what they say, meaning that it had sleeves and a neck hole and was slipped over the head. The Romans called this a tunic. The Greeks called it a chilton. So these 2-layer arrangement of clothing is what Jesus had in mind when he advised his disciples that if anyone wants to sue you, take your coat and give them your cloak as well. In other words, they had 2 pieces of garment. Matthew 5, verse 40. So both men and women wore this type of clothing, with women's outfits different from the man's primarily in length and color. And when I say that, I think it's if you are on Facebook and if you get some friend requests from people over in India, Pakistan, and other places, and they become your friend. I always, before I let them be my friend, I go through their Facebook page, and if they have photos, I go through those, because they have any immodest on there. I just sometimes I take the time to write and says, well, when you take your immodesty off your Facebook page, I'll let you be my friend. Most of the time I just delete them. But there's a lot of them, if you really want to see the difference in reference to clothing from India, Pakistan, and stuff like that, it's very interesting, especially now. I got a lot of people come from the Philippines, and they're very colorful, very colorful. I look at those things, I said, you mean to tell me those people are wearing that kind of colorful clothing to worship and so forth? But they do. And so they will show those. There is that difference. Say, there was, however, enough difference in the appearance of the garments that it was considered indecent for a man to wear a woman's tunic in cold weather, so it had to be a difference in them. My wife and I went to the Bartow County Sheriff's Department, and we took our got a gun permit and so forth, and we took the course down there, and they gave us T-shirts. And there's a ladies' T-shirt and there's a man's T-shirt. I never paid that much attention. No, it's a pullover shirt, sweatshirt like that. And I never paid much attention to that, but they were different because I got a large and she got an extra large, and my large is, as a man, was too kind of small for me, kind of tight. She said, here, you can have mine. I put it on. I said, there's something wrong with yours. It was different. So the same would be back then. But in cold weather, they would put on an extra tunic. And the Emperor Augustus, in his old age, usually wore 4 tunics and a heavy wool cloak in the winter. Elderly people also sometimes wrap pieces of wool around their legs. And I've seen some of that. When I went to Rigoletti, I saw where it was cool, and I always thought they were like stockings, like that. But they were heavy. You could tell they were heavy because they were dark. I mean, you couldn't see through them. You couldn't see the person's leg. All you did saw the color of it. You could tell they were thick and heavy. But you could, I mean, as far as all you can see from the foot up, as far as your dress went up or whatever, it was all the way up. So I don't know if it was just under clothing or what, but that's what they wore during the winter months. And we were there during the winter. Women typically wore that short tunic under a larger outer garment. So this outer robe, known as a stola, could be left unstitched at the shoulders to allow it to be put on or removed without disturbing the elaborate hairstyles popular in the New Testament times. And so in that case, it would be fastened at the shoulder with pins or brooches. And so one of the most captivating pieces of artwork from the antiquity, now in the National Museum in Naples, is a life-size bronze statue showing a young woman with her hands posed on her shoulders. She is either about she's about to unpin her stola, or she had just unpinned it. And so they have that. So these types of garments were universal around the Mediterranean bases, though there would have been local variations, just as some today from New York or Los Angeles wouldn't dress quite like someone from a small Midwestern town. In antiquity, only the barbarians wore breeches. Jewish clothing varied only slightly from the Greco-Roman. And so by the 1st century, it is questionable, according to the Encyclopedia Judicial, whether there was a distinctive Jewish dress. It's also significant that in the Midrash and the Mishnah and the Talmud, the words used to describe dress are almost entirely Greek or Latin terms transliterated into that of Hebrew, or most of the garments are of Greek and Roman or Iranian origin. And so another scholar sums it up this way. He says, Jews dressed like the rest of the Hellenistic world. As I said again, the Jewish people were scattered, so they went out into the Greek world. They picked up that culture. The basis of the native Jewish dress was the ketonet, a tunic, slightly shorter and closer fitting than the Roman model. And over this was a worn simla, a loose-fitting cloak. And important men in Judea would wear a meal, a long robe with long sleeves. We can see pictures of some of those at times in Bible class literature. And so people in the 1st century sometimes they also wore an undergarment, a lined cloth of cotton or wool, and this with a tunic tucked up was a common garb for men engaged in vigorous labor, like Luke 12, verse 35. And so we would find also that in warm weather, it might be the only clothing worn at work. So those Jews were generally more reluctant to exhibit their bodies than were the Greeks and the Romans. And women wore such a garment during their menstrual cycle and would also sometimes wear a breastband. Both sexes wore a belt around the tunic. And I think we see that when we see pictures where they have a belt around the tunic. which allows them to regulate the length of the garment. And so at times when speed or increased physical activity was necessary, the tunic could be drawn up and held in place by the belt or girdle. In the older translations, Luke 12:37, the belt was usually cloth, and John the Baptist's leather belt struck his contemporaries as worth nothing, Mark 1 and verse 6. And so we have no ancient information about the length of the belt, but Paul's was long enough that Agabus could bind the apostles' hands and feet with it in a symbolic gesture, Acts 21 and verse 11. So among that of the Greeks and Romans, wool was the most common material for both tunics and cloaks. And so in the early days of Greece and Rome, women were expected to spend a good portion of their time spinning wool and weaving garments. The Bible says in reference to women, they were keepers at home, and that's the idea there, was that they did this type of work. In the Near East, linen and cotton were favored for clothing. Garments intended for summer wear were woven more loosely than that of the winter garments. And so it brought about some complaints. Seneca complains of the disreputable men wearing tunics so loosely woven that one could see through them. And so men's tunics and their cloaks were normally left the natural color of wool and would at times be bleached white on special occasions. So the senatorial and the equestrian classes were allowed to have a purple stripe around the hem of their garment. Now, I stopped there again thinking about Libya being able to sell the purple, and since it's so expensive, you couldn't dye the whole thing. Women's dresses could be a variety of colors and have embroidery or design stitched on the hem or around the throat. For a Roman man to wear a colored tunic or a cloak except at dinner party was considered scandalous. In the provinces, however, there seems to have been more latitude in the matter of color. The only restriction was that purple was reserved for the very wealthy, Luke 16:19. Clothing styles also varied somewhere in that of the colder northern provinces. Now, so in chapter 7, or in our lesson 7, chapter 7 of the book, we have seen something of that of the Greek Roman society of the first century AD, how it was structured, how people ate, how they dressed, how they organized their day. And it's time for us to go look at something else in reference to their standards of morality and their standards of their personal behavior. Now, at that time, and just like it is today, those areas of questions of morality and the questions of our standards of our personal behavior, it was their greatest challenge, but it is also one of the greatest challenges that we have today in the church. And we still have problems with some of those things. So when we think about the ancient world and the topic of morality, we reach the point at which we differ most fundamentally from pagan antiquity. The things that we studied thus far, from political organizations to that of our dress, are recognizable variations of things that we do today. They may seem quaint, but we could probably imagine ourselves living under those conditions. But on the other hand, when we think about the Greco-Roman morality, it rests on an entirely different premises of ours. Few of us, conditioned since we are Americans, we are conditioned, even though I know our world is changing, but basically we are conditioned by Christian teaching and living under laws which the rest ultimately on the Judo-Christian tradition could imagine ourselves approaching morality on the basis which the Greeks and the Romans used. Now, sadly to say, we have a lot of people that could actually live in the Greco-Roman time in reference to morality. This is one area in which there is more than a area of truths as we think about what the Bible has to say and what people want to do. And so some people have a different perception than others. And so we find that when we begin to look at some of that, we find a spread through paperback novels and gladiator movies and Rome as a cruel, lascivious society. The fact is that for the Roman New Testament times, watching people die under the most barbaric condition in the arena was a standard means of amusing the idle populace through some intellectual like Seneca and Pliny did object to it, as we saw in lesson number 4. But seduction and adultery was the pastimes of the self-indulgent rich. Unwanted children were simply thrown away, sometimes even dumped in sewers. And so the Greco-Roman view of morality was so different from the Christian that the Christians saw themselves as surrounded by evil. Take your Bible and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And notice that Paul says that the only way that they could avoid association with immoral people, and he tells us there in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, he says, I wrote unto you in an epistle not to company with fornicators, yet not altogether with the fornicators of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or with idolaters, for then must ye needs go out of the world. Even the more sensitive among that of the Romans admitted that they were a corrupt people. They were willing to stop at nothing to advance their own interests. The Pliny, he says in his book, he says, many people regard public opinion highly, but hardly anyone follows conscience. Think about that. Lest we think him being over pessimistic, Sallust had a similar reaction when he began his political career in the 1st century BC. He found that recklessness, bribery, and great greed flourished instead of decency, restraint, and virtue. Now, I don't know how that, a lot of people view what goes on in our world today, but I mean, we can see even in the political world today, a lot of stuff that goes on that you and I, we just, I know people are very critical of those people that are in the political world, and I understand that. I mean, there are people that will help us, we would say, fight against abortion, but yet they themselves are, they're drinkers and other things that they do that we just abhor, but yet they see that, like abortion is wrong. And so we see that type of thing. And so when we talk about them and their morality, I hope by the end of our lesson that we will see let me change something right quick. You change the word. We'll see that such statements as minimal distortions, rather fair assessments of the moral bankruptcy, I guess, if we can call it ancient Rome. And probably, I mean, if all of us have maybe taken college courses or just really been members of the church for a long period of time, that we heard, illustrations in reference to the Roman people. I really think that if we were to read Romans chapter 1 and just simply say, well, we're going to apply Romans chapter 1 just to that of the Roman people. But we don't do that. Paul is actually giving a summation there of the Gentiles everywhere and what they believe and what they taught. And I gather that what happens there, and when I teach the book of Romans, I try to point this out. I said, here, Paul telling the Gentiles how bad they were. And then it seems as if off in the corner there, you could maybe in the church that Roman is being read, the letter was being read by, quote, the preacher or one of the elders there or something or other. If they had elders, I don't know. But somebody was reading this, and he was addressing that of the Gentile people, the Jewish Christians over here, those Christians who were Jews at one time, was probably sitting over there feeling real good about himself. But then Paul says in chapter 2, oh, you're not without excuse. Like he's talking to them over there, to the Gentiles, and all of a sudden he hears all this laughing going on. He says, hey, you're not without excuse. And so he talks about them. The idea is that because of the world, and because the Jews were in the world also. They weren't living up to the Old Testament morality that was given there. They were involved in all types of sinful things. They were following their traditions and things of that sort. And you have to remember, even in reference to marriage, divorce, and remarriage, what did they say? Jesus says it was because of the hardness of your heart that Moses gave that law. So what was wrong with their heart? It was hard. That's what was wrong with it. And they didn't want to listen. They continue to do what God said in the very beginning. And Jesus says, well, in the beginning, this is the way it was. And so you can see that. And so hopefully, maybe we will be able to see some of those characteristics as we go through and talking about the Greco-Roman morality and the personal reactions that they had. Now, the basis of this Greco-Roman morality, and again, I mean, I preach on things. I say in my book that I wrote on PTSD that 2 Peter 1 and verse 3 became to mean a lot to me, because it says there that God has given us all things that pertains to life and godliness. Now, as a preacher, I use that passage more probably than anything else, talk about godliness, how that we're supposed to live godly, and how ungodly people have become. But he says it gives us all things that pertains to life. And so that would include, well, yes, our morals, the type of morals that we're supposed to have, the type of conscience we're supposed to have, the type of heart we're supposed to have. But the crux of the problem is that morality, and it's from a Latin word meaning customs or habits, okay, that they must rest upon one of two sanctions, that is, divine authority or command wisdom. Now, anthropologists, those are the people who study that of us human beings, have shown that the laws which govern the behavior of any society are believed by the members of that society to have come from one source or the other. Now, I get in discussions, and I don't know if you get in discussions like I do. I guess because people find out that I'm a preacher, and then, and they ask things or say things. I get in discussions sometimes about we're not under the Ten Commandments. We're not under any of them. And somebody said, well, it's wrong to kill. Well, the Ten Commandments was given in Exodus. That's around 2,500 years after Cain killed Abel. So killing someone 2,500 years before Mount Sinai, where Moses got the Ten Commandments, was wrong. How is that wrong? Because it was a moral thing. These are things that they accepted to be right and wrong. The Ten Commandments were given to the Jewish people. And all those things that there, besides keep the Sabbath day holy, all those other things were true for everybody. Always have been, always will be. But keep the Sabbath day holy, and I just, discussions, I wrote an article for our newspaper called Change, Who Changed the Day of Worship. Boy, fellow called the preacher. Yes, I'm not the preacher anymore, so he called the preacher. And talked to him about that. He said, well, I'll give you Brother Gaten's address and telephone number if you want to call him. But he didn't call me. But I'd be more than happy to talk to him. But anyway, I mean, again, getting back to this, these anthropologists have shown that the laws which govern the behavior of any society, that goes all the way back to Genesis 1, are believed by the members of that society to have come from one source or the other. What source did "thou shalt not kill" come from? It came from God. And he taught that of Adam. Sometimes we don't realize that, the Bible actually deals with salvation history, and it doesn't give us everything that, that we say, or everything that we should be doing. We find it, it was wrong for Cain to kill Abel. Well, where is it commanded? And I think maybe sometimes we point out, well, Abel's sacrifice was accepted, and Cain's wasn't. Why? Well, Hebrews 11 verse 4 says that by faith, Abel offered more excellent sacrifice than Cain. By faith. By faith means he heard God's word. Romans 10:17. So there were things given that are not written. The world could not contain the books just written about the things that Jesus did. Could you imagine from Genesis even down to Jesus, how many books we would have to read? So in some cases, as with some of Confucian system, which dominated the Orient for so long, one man's wisdom was taken as valid for the society as a whole. I have problems with things like years ago when I lived in Conyers. There was a young boy that stayed out of school, and he ordered him a pizza from Domino's or someplace. I don't know, remember. And the girl who brought it, her husband was a deaf mute, and she was going to school. And I think she wanted to be a nurse, and she was working. She was going to school and working 2 jobs, and he was working. And this boy, ordered a pizza, laid out of school, ordered a pizza. And when she came to the door, he killed her. Cold-blooded murder, as I looked at it. And when they showed him on TV, and he walked in, he had this smirk on his face, like there was no repentance on his part at all. And I'd ask myself, how could a person get that way? Well, I don't know what he was reading, don't know what he was doing, but yet he had no respect for life. And so we'll find cases that the lawgiver asserts the authority of his code on the basis of its divine origin. The Babylonian code of Hammurabi, is that the way he said? Hammurabi, Hammurabi. Hammurabi. It has R-A-B-I, but it sounds like R-O-B-I. Hammurabi. Is that what you say? Hammurabi?
That's called Hammurabi.
Hammurabi.
I don't know what's right.
Rabbi. That's what I would say. Rabbi. R-A-B-I. Rabbi. And that was around the 18th century BC. He acknowledges that the gods had given the laws to the kings to pass on to the people at large. And a pattern familiar to us from Moses' experience on that of Mount Sinai. But stop for a moment and think. It was wrong before Moses ever got all those commands in reference to thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. But this idea of having other gods before me, you got to remember that the idolatrous people had all types of gods. Okay? So some of those things they were wrong among that of the heathen people anyway. The Judeo-Christian traditions, which dominates the modern Western society, sees morality as having divine sanctions. So one does not commit adultery, for example, because God says not to do that. And some people say, I don't see anything wrong with it. Well, the reason why you don't see anything wrong with it, Linda and I, my wife, was studying with someone, and this young lady was 31 or 32 years old. And we were studying with her, and the boyfriend that she was going with, he was studying to be a denominational preacher. This girl was brought up in a disciples church, and so she started attending. We set up a Bible study with her and was studying with her. And she was, like I said, 31, 32 years old, and she didn't see anything wrong with fornication. Her and this boy, and he was going to school, they were sleeping together. Now, they didn't live together, they were sleeping together. And when she found that out, she said, I was never taught that. And I said, I think to myself, you're 31, 32 years old, your mom and daddy didn't tell you, talk to you about purity and things of that sort. But see, she was ignorant. So maybe that's what's wrong with a lot of people today. They're just ignorant of what the Bible says that you can do and you can't do. Okay, let me cover one point, then we're going to stop here. The Greeks and the Romans, however, based their morality on laws that they, by an individual, and validated by the community, not the gods. We have to remember when we say that, the little g, because you got to think, who's going to tell them what the God says? That would be the high priest of those gods. And so you would have human beings telling them what to do because them gods didn't tell them anything. Okay? Each Greek city-state had its great lawgiver. Prime example are Solon for Athens and Lycurgus in Sparta. And much of like Plato's thought was devoted to working out an ideal political system based on laws formulated by human reason. Okay? The Romans looked at the 12 tables of the law, first written down in the mid-5th century BC. That's a lot of archaeological stuff on some of that. And based on legislation allegedly handed down by the Romulus, the founder of Rome, and Numa, another of its early kings, none of these laws codes even pretend to have a divine origin. The Greeks and the Romans did teach that one should not commit that adultery, but not because the act violates a divine prohibition. it was viewed as a violation of property rights. Now think about that. Property right. Other words, that's my property over there, and I guess since they may have had the same view that the man looked upon the woman as his property, but the woman probably might have the same view in some of those cultures that he was her property. So the Greek and Roman men didn't want another man sleeping with their wives who were their property. And we would find also that anymore, they looked upon their wives as their property any more than they wanted someone stealing their farm animals. So under such a system, any reluctance which an individual feels to commit adultery comes not from fear of divine retribution, but from the most prosaic fear of being caught by the husband's wife. A husband used to catch his wife, or the wife catch her husband, or whoever it may be, with somebody else. Sometimes somebody gets killed. If one believes that he can avoid detection, there is no reason not to commit the act. That's how they felt. They won't find out about it, therefore I'm going to do this, period. So the Greek view of morality is summed up by a man by the name of H.R. Byrne, in a way also out for that of Romans. For these people, he says this. He says law and customs exist not by nature or by unadulterable will of the gods, small g, but simply by custom or convention. It was then also a perilously short step from anyone who found traditional morality troublesome to appealing from it to the law of nature or of the jungle, either in power politics or in personal relationships. So that's how they think about stuff. So though the subject of morality covers business, politics, and interpersonal relationships, it is fairly easy to describe Roman behavior in those first two areas, but more difficult when it comes to the last. Self-interest were the dominant principles by which the Romans lived. The individuals was expected basically to do what was to his advantage, regardless of the effect it had upon anyone else, as long as he did not violate another person's property or didn't get caught. He was expected to repay favors, and not only that, but could count on having his favors returned also. So it shows us, in reference to that, that their behaviors, their morality wasn't, they were not concerned about the prohibition in reference to it, why it was wrong for them to do it. They just simply didn't want to get caught into it. Okay? All right, I'm going to stop there. And next week is March the 21st, first day of spring, isn't it? Is that right? Well, y'all know. Felt like spring today, but I don't know what it's gotten back out there right now. But
be careful coming home. It's thundering up here.
It is.
Yeah.
Thunder and lightning.
It's thundering out there. Were y'all reading, Steve?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we hadn't heard anything here, but it might be because I've been talking. I've been thundering. All right. Y'all have a good night.
See you, Bobby.
Good night.
All right.